Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of By the Way to Purposeful Procurement. And this is one of those episodes where I'm joined by two co-hosts. I'm joined in the studio by Rich Ham, Fine Tune
Phil.
CEO. So welcome, Rich.
Happy to be here.
And we're joined virtually by my partner at Art of Procurement, Kelly Barner. Kelly, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. And you know what we always say, you can never have too many hosts.
I know. Between the three of us, we may come up with something interesting and insightful.
Perhaps one or two. By the way, I think Phil is. And by the way, first of all, two items off the top. Number one, it has been recommended by others on my team that there should be a By the Way podcast drinking game, which is anytime somebody utters the phrase "by the way," not in reference to the title of our project, then that means go ahead and reach for your beer or whatever your libation is that you're enjoying at that time. Don't do this if you're at work or driving. Secondly, I think Phil is probably a little sheepish about referring to these episodes where he and Kelly and I are all digesting what we've just learned and looking ahead at the next episodes as the fill-ins episode. But I am a proud member of the fill-ins here, and so that's a PHIL-ins. We're kind of filling in the space between our guest-driven episodes and kind of navigating our way through this season. So this is the fill-ins.
I need to trademark that. So what we're really doing is we're weaving the story together.
That's right. Yeah.
As we go on this adventure and this journey.
Absolutely.
Over the course of the year. And in today's episode, we wanted to really reflect and look back on the last couple of episodes that we had, which was with Rob Hills and Kate Vitasek. And, it's kind of understanding their perspective. They've got very different perspectives because they come from very different backgrounds. But what are some of the common themes that we kind of see that thread those together? But let's talk specifically about individual episodes to start with. And the Rob Hills episode, Rich, what were some of your kind of key takeaways from our conversation with Rob?
Well, I thought Rob, and what we were trying to gain a little better understanding of from each of these episodes, both with Rob and with Kate, was how did we get here? And by here, we mean in this place where we are seeing that the flaws in the systems of incentive that procurement has been operating under for quite some time now have manifested in ways that are harmful and where the harms are worsening with time, and where there's also, I think there are kind of multiple factors here that are all interrelated, where there is an imbalance of power between buyers and sellers in 2025, where for a variety of reasons the sellers have kind of gained the upper hand in the ongoing buyer-seller joust. And I think both Rob and Kate Vitasek shared some very interesting insights along the lines of how did we get here. With Rob, it was kind of a journey through recent history where he talked about his work predominantly at Deloitte, where he ran supply chain and strategic sourcing, and how one of the things I found most interesting, he used this great metaphor where he talked about the problem with procurement planting the flag of savings before invading and conquering the lands, and I love this metaphor. And of course, this is one of the central flaws we're talking about when we consider procurement incentive plans. So I thought he was right on the money with calling out that problem. And he said that there was a period of years at Deloitte where they attempted to do more in the way of validation, and it was really driven or necessitated by getting into more contingency-based work, black ink projects, as he called them, where, coming out of the Great Recession, people didn't necessarily have a budget for consulting, but they said, hey, if you can make the money appear, well, great. But in those kinds of engagements, you have to prove that it is what you said happened actually happened. And so they kind of got into the business of validating savings initiatives more and more and trying to show the real P&L impact over time. And eventually they kind of arrived at the position that it was perhaps too burdensome, cumbersome. It's hard, and that maybe the juice wasn't worth the squeeze, and they started doing fewer of those kinds of engagements. And so I found Rob's narrative along those lines to be very, very interesting. And I think, and I've also talked with Rob some offline outside the podcast, and we discussed how has the problem, and if the problem in planting the flag, why would it be problematic to plant the savings flag before you've conquered the lands? Well, the problem is that there's this gap between negotiation and execution, and what you negotiate doesn't always actually happen the way it's supposed to. And so what if that problem has worsened over time? What if the negotiation execution gap is growing over time? And he seemed to think, yeah, it is. Well, that means that the case for doing the hard thing, the validation, is a stronger case now than it was 15 years ago. And I see this in indirect services all the time. The indirect services tactics have all been directed at growing margin after deals get signed, changing the rules, extracting margin, driving spend up after deals get signed. And so I think that not only is the case for the validation post-deal is a stronger case than ever, but I actually think, and we'll get into this later, I think in upcoming episodes, technological advancements are making it more doable. What might have been really hard in 2011, 2010 is actually more attainable today. And so I think those will be some of the threads that we'll bring with us from the Rob Hills episode. I have thoughts on Kate, our discussion with her too, but I don't want to move on too quick because I'd love to hear from Kelly. Kelly, what were some of your reactions to the discussion with Rob?
I thought it was interesting, this idea that it certainly is a problem that's been recognized. It's a problem that people have been trying, and very serious people, to have an issue that Deloitte is trying to solve and can't necessarily find an obvious way. That gives you an indication of how serious an issue this is. But I actually want to pick up on your comment about kicking the can down the road, Rich, because I think there's a couple of different ways to look at how that plays into the whole situation of where we are today. On the one hand, yes, it has made it a more important problem than ever to solve. On the other hand, the longer you're able to continue kicking the can down the road, the easier it gets to convince yourself that it's okay to continue doing so. And I do think that there's always so much work to be done and so many challenges. And a lot of it is very strategic, long-term planning, right? Involving company-wide leadership. But you can lull yourself into a place where you say, well, we haven't solved it until now, and they've kind of been okay with it. And so maybe we'll just sort of continue to plant that flag with bravado. Nobody's going to question what it says on the flag. And the fact that we've continued kicking the can down the road almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to continue doing the same as the problem, as you said, continues getting larger.
Yeah, I think as it continues to be a problem, and we talked in the Rob Hills episode about, I've got some history in terms of trying to solve that problem, and it became too difficult as well for the organizations that I was working for, and they said, it's not really worth it. And it's something to be solved for, but it also brings us back to the problem that we have, that all of our value measurement is in the savings basket. Yeah. So if this is the only way that we're going to demonstrate that we have value to our organization, for a lot of organizations that are out there, not every organization, but a lot of organizations that are out there, if we cannot, isn't that even more reason to look for other value drivers that can be validated in other ways that may not be P&L impact, but can be looked upon by the organization to say, yes, that was a value add because it drove different outputs, or it helped us mitigate risks in certain ways, or bring some more innovation into the business, that we should absolutely be focusing on that when we're measuring our impact. Even if we're only being measured on savings, we should be demonstrating that there's value to be had in other areas, so that it's not just all or one, all or nothing. Do I believe your reported savings number or not?
Yeah, I totally agree. I also found it interesting that Rob, I asked him, when you went back in to validate an initiative, was it usually what it was supposed to be, or had it eroded to some extent, and did it fall short of what you had forecast? And he said, "Oh, it's so common that it normally would fall short." And I can tell you, having been working in indirect services over the last couple of decades, like, to whatever extent that was true in 2010, 11, 12, it's dramatically more true now. And we did a study recently of just across our client accounts where, we were trying to answer the question, let's put a number to the value of our cost avoidance efforts. And I use that phrase, and I think it's silly because I'm really just using a term that corporate procurement tends to use. Oh, that's not savings, that's cost avoidance. What you really mean is that, and it has a few different definitions, but it's like, I put this deal in place, it drove costs down, that was the savings. If I fend off stuff that a vendor was coming at me, attacking me with over time, that's cost avoidance. To me, it's all just money, and so, but we wanted to look at what was the value of our post-deal work the fending off of the vendor margin grabbing efforts after the deal got signed. It was 18% across. Now this is across a spectrum of indirect services, but on a per annum basis, and this is, of course, in some respects you have to say, okay, well, in fairness, this is vendors that have just, usually we're coming into this phase of our client life cycles having just saved them 20, 30, 40%. So the vendors are trying to reclaim lost margin. So maybe there's a little bit of added aggression there where they've just lost margin. But still, the question becomes, okay, well, what would we know validation is hard, but what would the cost be? I can tell you this: it's not 18%. You're not going to spend double-digit percentage points of a category to validate that what you've put in place in that category hits the P&L and sticks over time. It's a very low single-digit percent.
So it's interesting when you talk cost avoidance, because some organizations will use cost avoidance as as part of their savings methodology and calculation and reporting, and oftentimes finance will look at that and say that's just made up money, and I can see the argument in some ways, because how can we ever prove that was because of procurement's involvement?
Yeah.
That somebody else wouldn't have achieved that savings as well. But does that mean we should be talking about cost avoidance differently? Because it's really interesting what you just said about framing it up that a supplier has lost a lot of margin or a lot of earnings potential, typically through a sourcing process as they get to sign the deal. They're probably a bit miffed by the time they sign the deal that this isn't the deal that we thought when we put it in sales CRM that we thought we were going to get from it, and so we need to try and claw that back. So positioning cost avoidance as protecting clawback, or bringing it in more real terms as just this funny money that never. I just think maybe there's a rebranding opportunity for us in how we talk about cost avoidance.
Yeah, later in the season, we're going to talk about new terminology, I think, and new definitions of key terms. I think that would be very healthy. In our world, cost avoidance means literally there's a charge that appeared on an invoice that shouldn't have been there. We caught it. Our auditing caught it. We got it corrected and got the underlying issue fixed and got the money refunded.
That's real savings.
To me, that's just save, right?
Yeah.
But I will have clients will say, "Oh no, that's not savings. That's just cost avoidance." And I'm like, "What?" Anyway, the Kate Vitasek conversation, I think, talked about similar themes, but at a more macro level that goes beyond the perspective of the procurement department, and was more a conversation about buyer-seller relations broadly, and that we have a buyer-seller problem, and then but they both seemed in a lot of ways to be telling us that we're lacking in equilibrium today between buyers and sellers for a variety of reasons, and Kate certainly highlighted certain forms of dysfunction on the buyer side, which have brought a level of toxicity to buyer-seller relationships, making them less relationships and more transactional than perhaps ever before. I found that interesting and very much on theme with what we've been discussing. What were you guys' reactions to that?
I think that we talked a lot about relational contracts, and Kate has done such an amazing kind of body of work around kind of win-win relationships and driving win-win relationships. I think what was important to note, we talked about power dynamics and kind of relying on leverage back in as we started to professionalize the procurement profession, but that really how we should look at what we buy fits on a continuum. So there are some things where maybe power dynamics, price-based, it makes sense to do that, and actually. But on the flip side, by buying in that way, even for some of those categories where it kind of lend themselves to that, you're disincentivizing the suppliers to be anything other than transactional with you as well in how they earn their money. But there's a place for that, and then there's of course a continuum at the other side where savings shouldn't be a word. It's all about outputs and outcomes, and how can you come together to create relationships and situations with suppliers where you're both on the same side. And you've identified what success looks like and how success should be valued and measured, both in your payment structure, but also in how you're capturing that. And that should be driving your relationship. And it's not necessarily an either or. It's just there is a place for everything based on what are the things that you're buying and what's the... but what we tend to do is we tend to use a one size fits all model to everything, which is where some of the difficulties come in.
Yeah, I agree. And the one thing that I really was struck by that Kate spoke about was how the lay of the land that we've created today does not promote sustainable buyer-seller relationships. Like for example, and it opens the door to this fakery and dysfunction that we've talked about in various moments along the way in this project. But for example, when the definition of savings on the buyer side is not just cost focused alone and not a more all encompassing value focused, but it's not just cost focused; it's projected cost focused, and even that projection is limited to the coming 12 months, but nothing beyond it. So it's such a limiting. So what sellers learn over time is, okay, what do I need to give this buyer to win? How do I win? Oh, I win by getting whatever I'm proposing to them to look, not to be, but to look as good as possible in the short term. And she used a great phrase along the way in that episode, short-termism. She said short-termism has gotten out of hand. I can't quote her exactly, but it was like, a scourge in the world of procurement. And I couldn't agree more. And if you redefined the metric that the department was incentivized to pursue to not be this projection of what might happen only over the next 12 months, but actually a holistic view of the value that a particular supplier relationship might bring to a business, you'd certainly get away from a lot of the fakery, but you would actually incentivize the suppliers to be more real in their dealing with you, that they would come to you with proposals that were more holistic and real and that would consider not the short and medium and long-term implications of whatever it was that they were proposing to you. And I think over time, because I do believe in that markets are, when you're doing all this right, it produces good outcomes. And I think over time you would find buyers and sellers arriving at a more sustainable way of working together. And I'll throw this to you, Kelly, because you were part of this conversation when we talked with Kate recently. She reminded us that there was a time in business history where the buyers and sellers largely were neighbors. Yes. That's there was 100 years ago and more, that was buyers and sellers had no choice, but it couldn't be just transactional with a winner and a loser. They had to find that place where they were both able to win just enough that they could be a winner, but also the buyer and the seller could both be winners. What were your reactions to that?
So one of the things, and it is funny that Kate pointed that out, and for a couple of reasons. One is obviously, she's absolutely right. I mean, relational business is absolutely part of the historic fiber of how this system has been created. Now, at that time, probably simpler things were being produced and sold, simpler services were being offered and purchased. So you weren't necessarily talking about, we were just talking about Deloitte, right? Because of Rob. You weren't necessarily talking about, Kelly hangs out a shingle in the center of town and she said, oh, I'm going to offer, management consulting services. It was more like, come buy this produce, come get this basic household service. But the relational aspect of things hasn't really changed as products and services have both become more complex and also as the system has become larger and more global. And I think one of the interesting things that's part of Kate's whole philosophy, this idea that it's a system. It's not just what buyers are doing or what sellers are doing, but how all of their reactions to things end up affecting each other and then the deals and the contracts long term. And it's really interesting how it ties back to all of our conversations about incentives. Because for anybody that's ever read either any of Kate's vested books or Strategic Sourcing in the New Economy or, any of the ways that she's looked at this, you'll notice that it doesn't matter what industry a company's in, how large they are, how mature they are, whether they're even public sector or private sector. But the reality is, if you establish the same incentive, you get the same output. So if something like savings or spend under management is overly emphasized as a business objective, doesn't matter how big the team is, where they're located, what their backgrounds are, they're going to take the exact same steps in response to that incentive. And unfortunately, then you get situations where a company brings in the world's leading supplier in X, doesn't matter what it is, but because procurement is so overemphasizing control in order to get to that point of savings, that we pick them for being the best. And then we end up turning around and telling them exactly how we want them to do their jobs, which of course drives all of the potentially added benefit and value out of that whole relationship. I find it interesting how consistent it is. And I think for anybody, like I said, who's read any of her books, you will find yourself in the common flaws, no matter what your background is, which does suggest that this is a much larger issue that all of us are sort of indirectly being guided by, versus any one of us or any one of our teams saying, oh, we're going to make sure we drive all the value out of this system by being overly focused on savings. That is certainly not it, but it's a system-wide issue with good intent that's ultimately leading us down a road it's not in our best interest to go down.
Yeah, Kate made a good point that this isn't necessarily procurement's battle to solve on our own. It
Definitely not
relies
alone.
on stakeholders, but it relies going level the executives within our organizations. And that's not to say that we put our hands up and say, well, this isn't anything for us we don't need to worry about this until we're told what to do, because it's absolutely part of, I think it's an imperative for us to continue to be invested in, among competing investments that an organization may make, to position ways that we can help the business in different ways. But again, we're not on our own to solve this. But that something interesting, you were just talking about her experience in doing a lot of the vested deals with clients that are taking place around the world. And, we often are coming to conversations with our stakeholders, and they are generally savings led, even though we may hide that. We may use some language around that's not related to savings, so we're not scaring a stakeholder to want to work with us. But ultimately, that's kind of where the focus is. When Kate and her team and a lot of the certified deal architects that have gone through Kate's programs are approaching stakeholders of big deals and talking about this different way that procurement can help, and different approaches to a supply relationship, the business is saying, well, where do I sign up? This is what I want. So there's this demand for a different way of doing things, but that demand also needs courage, as we talked about in the episode, to be open to admit that, look, the way that we're doing things at the moment isn't necessarily getting the best long-term sustainable value for the business in buying A, B, and C, whatever A, B, and C may be.
I was really happy to hear her say that, but it was something I already believed. That I think one of the outputs of this project, for whatever people find themselves moved to take some new action in their organizations because of things they've picked up along the way, I think people will find that there is openness to solving a problem and making the business better for it. And I think that you will find, I think it's possible for some procurement professionals to establish themselves as change agents in ways that nobody outside the department really saw coming. That where all of a sudden there was like a procurement pro that went into the chief executives or the chief financial officer's office and said, here's this problem with this system that I've identified. Here's a solution I think we could implement. And if we did, I think over the next, a CFO, for example, would love to see some analysis that said, yeah, I think there's 10% in indirect that this could impact if we just implemented a more ownership-minded, approach to the way we're doing this. And other forms of value creation could be a part of the analysis too. So I also think, though, that it shouldn't be any great surprise that we've arrived at a place where we're lacking in equilibrium when you have a department that can win even if the business loses. And along these lines, I found a great quote, and I didn't find it. I have to give credit to Dan Kreitz from our team who brought it to me. But this is from, and we were hearkening back to a simpler time where the buyers and sellers were neighbors, Kelly, and in some research leading into this episode, Dan found John C. Dinsmore's Purchasing Principles and Practices from 1922. And there's a great quote in this piece that says, In any case, there should be no great chasm between the board of directors who represent the stockholders whose money is spent and the person who does the spending. And of course, this is true. It's like one of the most obvious statements you'd ever hear anywhere. Yes, there should be alignment between the business and the purchasers. And yet, we've devised a system of incentives where it's possible for the purchasers to win while the business loses. And over time, that's going to create an imbalance of power. The suppliers find ways to gain the system. I'll give you this win, but I'll really win over the next 5 years. I'll emerge the victor in a million ways. And so I think that if we can find a way to drive better alignment from procurement to the business's true and holistic interests, we can actually find our way to not only a better equilibrium between buyers and sellers, but more sustainable business between buyers and sellers.
100 years later after that quote, we're still struggling with the same problem.
Right.
And it feels like core to that is, how can we do that in a way that still justifies investment in procurement and procurement as a function? And that's the $64,000 question, and one that we'll be exploring as we go through the rest of the series.
And one immediate thought on that topic, Phil, before we bring it to a close, but I think one of the outcomes of this project for any company who buys into whatever new approaches we end up publishing at the end of the journey will be that they'll realize, oh, actually, we have to beef up procurement because there's the value, the case is there for a more holistic approach to the way we're measuring procurement, but getting there and doing those things takes more effort. Yeah. There's more to it than just putting a deal in place or as lobbing a contract over the wall and hoping for the best. That takes effort, but if the effort costs 1% of indirect and the value is 5, 6, 7, 10 times that, well, of course, a business will do it. We just have to convince them that the case is there. But I actually think investment in procurement would follow. Now, what that investment looks like with AI, new technologies creeping in, we'll explore that too in the latter half of the season because, of course, it won't be the same as it ever was, throwing 200 heads at a problem. But there will be some humans involved too, I'm quite certain.
Well, in the next, one I would say, I think as we come to the part of the journey where we're starting to look at solutions, right now we're gathering information, insights, perspectives, experiences. We will be transitioning later in the series to, okay, now let's try and put all these together to think about what do we do differently. So certainly a lot of what Kate shared with us today is going to be really interesting to kind of reflect back on as we get to the, okay, what now part of this journey. Coming up in the next 3 episodes, we're actually speaking to some subject matter experts with very specific expertise, both in the GPO space, but also specific categories of spend, to really talk about what is this system that we have? How is it allowing suppliers to take advantage of because of the incentives we have in place, or because of the system, the structure that we have in place, the structure related to when procurement professionals are involved versus when we're not involved, up to the time of a deal, but not post-deal, or because of the way that we're measured, does that mean we're signposting to suppliers that they need to come to the table to do something at deal time, and then making up all the difference, they're making up what they lost when they came and signed a deal that's aligned with what we want them to do when we actually hand them back into the business, and for them to then be operating that deal and trying to operationalize the deals they put in place.
And I think, Phil, in those episodes, we're going to see that we've kind of established, there's flaws in the system, and those flaws create certain harms to the status quo. I think these next 3 episodes are probably going to reinforce to us that, not only are there harms, the harms are worsening with time. Mm-hmm. And I think that will be a key takeaway, I suspect, from these conversations. And I'm really excited in the next episode to talk to David McCarty, who is one of the original founders of Corporate United and is an absolute guru from the GPO world. Yep.
All right. Well, we'll leave this episode there. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Rich. And
Absolutely.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with David McCarty, as you said, one of the founders of Corporate United, to talk about his perspective from a lot of experience both in GPOs, but also post his Corporate United days outside of the GPO space.
Can't wait.
All right.
Great to
Thanks
see you
a lot,
guys.
everybody.
Bye,
Take care.
Kelly.